Hi, welcome to the Expressed on Purpose podcast. I'm your host, Adrian-Smith. This podcast is on a journey to uncover the essence of full, authentic expression, to support high achievers, entrepreneurs, and executives to reconnect with their life's purpose and live a rich life. I offer a novel path to move from dissatisfaction and anxiety into purpose, passion, and power. We'll be interviewing an intriguing array of intellectuals, thought leaders, facilitators, and guides who are being expressed on purpose, honing their crafts. In today's episode, we'll be interviewing Frank MacOwen, a poet and guide in psychospiritual process work, who shares his journey towards authentic expression and a life rich in purpose and connection. Rooted in Taoist, Zen, and Shinto-inspired spirituality, Frank offers insights on the path of wayfaring, a way of living guided by nature, contemplation, and creativity. He describes a rich life as a unique journey shaped by self-discovery, alignment with one's true essence, and staying connected to something larger than oneself. Through meditation, gardening, and writing poetry, Frank finds daily renewal and meaning. We discuss the importance of drawing inspiration from spiritual traditions and past poets without merely imitating them, as a true fulfillment lies in embracing one's own path. This conversation is a call to let go of shame, embrace one's inner wisdom, and connect deeply with nature as a source of healing and inspiration. Through the creative process and the power of poetry, Frank shows how we can align with our authentic selves and live a life of purpose and wonder. Let's dive in. But before I open it, just wanted to ask, how are you doing? How are you today?
Well, it's an interesting time. It feels like, I don't know if you're following any of the politics down here, but it kind of feels like we're living in a vice and things are getting very tight. And I'm sure that's true other places, but I'm noticing a lot of tension, I guess, just on the collective level. And then when I encounter individuals, it's obvious that people are wearing that intensity of these times. So that's, I am doing very well, but, it's navigating through these times that utterly unique.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating time to be alive, really, in the last decades, years, months, even. It's kind of a wild, I mean, I guess every generation is always new and novel in different aspects, but this one seems to have some pretty breathtaking events going on.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to hear that you're doing well. I'm glad to hear that you're personally in a good place. I know that it's sometimes easy to get sucked into the collective energies, and so that's great to hear. So I'm just gonna, I like starting with a couple of breaths together, so we can just ground in, so we can just close our eyes, and then just take a deep breath in through your nose and let it out with a sigh in your mouth. So we'll do, starting with an inhale, breathing in. The second inhale, breathing in deep into your belly. And the last, final, deep cleansing breath, breathing in. Beautiful. Well, welcome, Frank MacOwen, to the Expressed on Purpose podcast. It's a pleasure to connect with you again and to meet you again at the proverbial bottom of the mountain.
Great to
Today
see.
is going to be a very interesting journey. And I keep using the word journey, and it's a word that you often use, and I really love that analogy. And so to set the scene, I'd love to just explain a little bit about how we first met, and then for you to share a little bit about who you are, and then we'll start exploring some of these topics of full authentic expression, what purpose is, finding purpose in life, finding meaning in life, and this movement that I'm founding right now of the Rich Life movement, and what your kind of take on it is. So briefly, to set the scene, I stumbled across your book on the Sunshine Coast on the west coast of Canada in a very small shop called an Oracle shop, and they have a whole plethora of gems and spiritual books, and your book there, the Celtic way of seeing was just sitting there on the shelf, and somehow I felt called to read it. I loved the book and the concepts in it, and some of the ideas that you were sharing. And for whatever reason, I decided to reach out to you. And
Right.
it was at that moment where you said that was 20 years ago. I've evolved a lot since then. But this was how the first breadcrumb I stumbled across to bring and weave our paths together. And then we did a session together, which was a
Right.
very unique path-finding, purpose unveiling session that's unlike something I've done before. And it was very insightful. I had a lot of different directions to go in. And this was about, I think, 2 years ago, maybe even 3
Yeah.
years ago now,
Yeah.
when we first spoke. And so obviously a lot has unfolded since then. We haven't spoken since that time. There was a few back and forths where I was going to do another session. But yeah, this is our first coming back together again at the proverbial mountain,
Yep.
the new fork in the road. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you again. And yeah, I would love for you to share a bit about what you bring to the world and how you bring it, if you're able to share that.
Yeah, the abbreviated version is really my spiritual journey began right on the cusp of childhood and adolescence. I had a dream, and the dream's quite simple. We were visiting my maternal grandmother, and it was a long trip, and so everybody was sleeping in. That morning, I had this dream where I woke up, everyone was asleep. I get up, I walk through the house, I go to the back door, I go out into the backyard, walk the full length of the backyard to where there was old growth forest, and then this owl glides by. So that was the dream.
Wow.
So I wake from the dream, everybody's asleep, I get up, I walk to the back door, I go out into the backyard, I go back to where the forest is, and an owl glides by exactly like my dream.
Wow. Beautiful.
So as a 12-year-old little guy thinking, what is this?
Am I still dreaming?
And my mother at the time was being trained as a chaplain supervisor, and part of their process was to choose a personality theory to work with. And so she had all these books on Carl Jung. She had the Chinese book of the Book of Changes, the I Ching. So as a kid, I immediately tear into these books trying to figure out what was that dream, and stumbled upon this concept of synchronicity. That kind of was the trailhead of my awakening, that something more than meets the eyes going on here.
Wow.
And so that unfurled into me getting very interested in spirituality in general, world spiritual traditions. Really the first things that I started to look at as a kid was Taoist philosophy and Zen. But I read about every, essentially, religion, and my parents were both ordained Methodist ministers, and so I was kind of in that atmosphere of the spiritual to begin with. But something about that form didn't speak to me. I sensed something deeper and beyond it that had to do with nature, and so that has been the thread all the way through. And without going into a lot of depth, I'll just say that it took me into indigenous cultures to try to make sense of what is it that these different earth peoples are tuned into that somehow our culture has become divorced from, meaning Western culture. And then that led me to looking into some of our British, Celtic, Scandinavian, to try to find out what might still be alive in those traditions. And then to put a bow on this, ultimately, I realized that, I live in North America, and if I wanted to work with some of those traditions, I would need to go live there. So then that led me into this whole thing of how do I work with spirituality and a connection to nature in a way that doesn't steal from other cultures or lift from their way of being, but that is authentic to who I am and where I live. And so that's been a lot of my own personal journey. my academic journey is that it took me to Naropa University, where I studied transpersonal psychology, Jungian psychology, and that enabled me to kind of understand that there are deeper forces within us, within the psyche. Of course, Freud acknowledged the unconscious and sort of saw it as a dustbin of repressed material, whereas Jung and his idea of the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, he really saw it, and these are my words, but he saw it as more of a mystery school that we end up apprenticing to and being initiated by. And so that slowly but surely has led me to this body of work that I do with people that is inviting them to tune into that level, and what I sometimes talk about as the what's trying to happen in their life. So
yeah, beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I feel very drawn to now with today and all of your understandings. How would you help the 12-year-old you to understand that dream that you had?
Right. Well, with the language that I have now, I think it would simply be to encourage the natural childhood mysticism that began to develop, and perhaps provide a softer landing in some sense, because those experiences and then my further explorations at the time, I felt the tension between what I was being called to and the religious tradition that I found myself around that seemed profoundly divorced from a connection to Earth and was suspect, perhaps, of spiritual experiences that fell outside the parameters. So, yeah, I think if I could go back and sort of be the big brother to my 12-year-old self and walk forward in time, it would be, to journal. Use a journal. Keep track of your experiences. Pay attention to your dreams. Normalize the non-ordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. I think that's a very powerful message. I guess it's the two-sided. It's one, finding a guide in us, someone who can support you on that path, and also the self-inward journeying of what it means to you is really the meaning of all of this. And no one can really tell you what it is other than you and your feelings to help you to say, this feels like what it is. And
Yeah.
no one can debate your feelings, although some feelings can be swayed depending on the collective.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think there's a beautiful journey to go on at such a young age, to have that kind of new doorway of perspective opened up to you. And my interpretation of spirituality is really a connection to self, and connection to self is connection to this spirit, this universal energy that is driving everything around us, from the skin on our bodies to the glass of water next to us to the internet that we're talking through.
Right.
But I feel like a lot of religions are all pointing at the same thing, but don't want to allow anything else other than their way of showing to be the way. They all say, this is our God and no other God is allowed. This is the way and no other way is open. And so I wonder how you then chose to go down the Taoist path or the Buddhist path as your kind of chosen means of self-inquiry and meditation.
Right. Well, what's interesting about that is at a certain stage, after my explorations in Native American tradition, very, very early on, and South American to a certain extent, and then being drawn to explore some of the Celtic and what might still be around from that, I got very interested in, well, it's more of a circling back around to, because I did study some Buddhism academically. What's interesting about this is that I actually developed kind of an allergic reaction to the whole guru thing. And part of that was because I had friends that were directly impacted by some of these scandals that began to pop up in different, whether it was Tibetan or Zen. And at a certain stage, I had just seen enough and really kind of arrived at this, I'm going to go my own way and not deal with teachers. And that's when I met my teacher. And she was 20 years my senior, and she was very unorthodox herself. So she wasn't like a traditional Buddhist or Taoist. And laid out kind of in front of me this basically trailhead of looking at this lineage of loosely connected wayfaring poets. And when you look at their lives, not just their poetry, but when you look at their lives, even they, they had studied different types of meditation, or they had brushed sleeves with different spiritual concepts and traditions, but even they went their own way. And so I gravitated toward that style of spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And you also wrote books of poetry along the way.
Yes. Yeah, I have 3 books of poetry and working on number 4. So.
Okay, beautiful. And maybe you can explain a bit about your process for channeling or creating within this poetry aspect, and how that links in with some of this wayfaring you're doing.
Yeah, and it ties in with the theme that we've mentioned today, the full authentic expression. Mm-hmm. This sense of expression, for me, at least in my own creative process, is really the tail end of a larger process that for me includes gestation and then integration. And when the gestation and integration have taken place, then the expression becomes the natural outflow of that. And for me, creativity, I think about Matsuo Basho, the great Japanese poet who equated the creative with nature. So there's this way in which even human creativity can be an extension or expression of natural energy, cosmic energy. In Japanese culture, this individual Kukai was also a poet, was an artist, and viewed that expression as a kind of distillation of his Dharma practice. So Dharma art, in a sense. And so it's art that not only is an expression and an extension of the practitioner's inner experience, but as the viewer or the reader of that, it can then activate some of that same energy in the viewer or the reader. So I think that really is how I got involved with all of this, is that my late teacher would put poems in front of me to meditate on and to see, well, what does this poem stir within you in between hill walking sessions and extended meditation retreats.
Yeah, beautiful. It sounds like a wonderful experience you've had out there. There's many different angles I want to go in with this. One of them, I think, as a useful kind of side note, is maybe you can briefly explain what your understanding of Dharma is. People who don't know what Dharma actually is.
Sure. Dharma, Sanskrit word, it sometimes gets translated as law or natural process, teaching, principle. Similar to Tao in that regard is that, but one way of thinking of Dharma is reality just as it is. So, for instance, there is a Dharma of nature. There is a Tao of nature. And, some of the old translations of the Tao Te Ching, one of the seminal texts of the Taoist tradition, one translation says, Tao is nature, nature is Tao. And another translation of some of the writings of Bodhidharma, who was a Zen progenitor of Zen within China, one translation of this is that Tao is Zen and Zen is Tao. So there's this through line of these traditions, and they influenced each other.
And the law of Dharma, as I interpret it, is as the kind of a purpose. This way of being is also kind of a purpose of how it's coming to express. So someone's Dharma of their life might be as you're kind of expressing now, a poet and a way shower, and being in this state of hermiting and reflecting and being able to guide as a part of your Dharma.
Sure, sure. And there's, what comes to mind is there's this phrase that there's 88,000 Dharma doors. So there's this automatically at the beginning, this understanding that there are infinite expressions for wayfaring. It may take one expression with this person because that's their karmic dispensation. And then someone else, it may be perhaps embodied differently.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of challenge of the human life, is that you kind of are brought up in a way that's very kind of follow the lines. You have parents to tell you what to do, school to tell you what to do, jobs to tell you what to do, and then one day you might suddenly realize, actually, I can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a level of daunting possibility or unknowingness that comes with there's 88,000 doors, which one's right for me to go down?
Right.
And that's why I think it's beautiful to have this analogy of the man at the bottom of the hill, and kind of what I loved as a child is playing games on the computer and going on a quest.
Mm-hmm.
Going on a quest, you venture out and then you return back.
Mm-hmm.
And
sure.
Kind of like the hero's journey, you leave one person, you go on this beautiful adventure, and you come back someone else. And there was it's not about the end point. It's not about listening to music because you want the music to finish as the destination. It's about listening to all of the notes on the song. And so I feel like potentially with poetry, there's also this similar analogy of the whole thing and each individual line and the spaces between which you're filling with your own filter and your own perception and your own soul's identity is what creates that expression in that form.
Right.
And so within this idea of full authentic expression, you've talked a little bit about this creative outlet. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your way of living and how that feeds in with your dharmic expression and also your kind of chosen path, because the term hermit and hermiting might be novel to some people.
Right.
So I'd love for you to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, and I think, I want to clarify what I mean in the sense of hermit. I don't like live in a cave in the mountains or anything, but it's more about putting one's spiritual practice front and center, like prioritizing that. And, as far as my own path, tuning in with this word full and authentic, that gets interesting, because going back to this idea that we have the unconscious, the personal unconscious, or what in Taoist language might be the dark enigma layers of the self that we can't even fully know because it is a vast reservoir. And so this notion of we're apprenticing to the deeper aspects of ourselves and being recipients to what is revealed over time, that's an initiatory process. And it's one that, regardless of kind of the outer forms that I may have been exploring at any given point along my journey, that's a through line. That's sort of the binding thread here, is that there's always been this sense of trying to pay attention to what is emerging from the depths of, say, what Kukai called the great self, as opposed to the small self or the world-conditioned self. And where this really gets activated, not only for me personally, but in the work that I do with some people, is it's almost like a spring-loaded process that is within midlife. In the first half of life, we've built this whole thing. Maybe we've gone through our education, we begin developing a career, we cultivate a kind of professional identity, we've, developmental steps, maybe we've gotten married, maybe we've had kids, etc., and so forth. And then there comes a point where, okay, now what? And James Hollis, the Jungian writer, calls it the middle passage. And it's this psychospiritual midlife activation. And in the midst of that, it depends on the person, but sometimes that can be a gentle ride of growing clarity that something else is trying to happen. For somebody else, it could be almost like clinging to the rocks of what one has built as the river is trying to take you in a different direction. And so that's some of what I do with people, is to try to make sense of that process. And this notion of purpose, this notion of one's own personal Tao or Dharma, in the real loose sense of that, sometimes it's in the midst of that middle passage where that lantern of the heart-mind gets lit and this new purpose suddenly starts to gain traction, and that ends up being what the second half of life is about for that person. So
yeah, powerful. I mean, there's a lot to uncover there, and I've loved the work from James Hollis that you've shared. It's been very thought-provoking and inspiring to really journey of that. And I guess also it might be interesting to say, just kind of bring it back to this hermiting aspect, in relation to, this is the way that your life is unfolded at this moment, where you've seen, this is the way that I can live fully into this aspect of leaving the old house, the old identity, and walking down into the nature and being as close to nature as possible, as a way to reconnect with yourself, with the broader self, with spirit, with all the wisdom. And the owl represents a beautiful identity of wisdom somehow, that's just fluttering past you.
Right.
And whether you're there at that moment or not, it's still going to fly. You can observe it, or you can choose to be in your own bubble, in your own world. And I think within this full authentic expression, and this idea of clinging onto the rock, the egoic's desire to hold on to the way that things are known in order to find safety in that knowingness and in that comfort. And actually, there was this great video I saw online of, there was this kid who was holding on to this branch over a river, and the river was rushing down, and he was screaming and crying, going, no, no, no. And then his mum comes along and pushes his legs down, and he just stands up. And the river was only this deep.
Right. Yeah.
And I thought that was a beautiful analogy of this kind of egoic's desire of, I can't possibly let go, it's terrifying. And then you're like, oh, actually, it's fine.
Right.
And nature has this, I say funny, but I mean kind of supernatural way of giving us these lessons to face the things that we fear the most, so that we can move through that dark passage, the middle way, and recognize, oh, there's a beautiful mountain, there's a beautiful landscape, there's a beautiful way of being that I can be here with the lessons that I've learned along the way, and continually get, some people use the word tested, but what I like to see it now is a challenge. It's your opportunity to put what you've learned to the test. It's your opportunity to say, I've done all this work at the gym, I'm now strong, I now want to climb the mountain. It's not to say, oh, woe is me, there's a mountain in front of me.
Right.
How terrible is that? It's the life happens for us rather than to us. And so, I keep circling back down to this hermit aspect, because I think that it's curious for a lot of people who are kind of hermiting to a degree in their own apartments or in their houses, without intentionally having it connected to nature, without intentionally having it being a thing, and then are actually numbing, whether it's with Instagram or social or TV or whatever it might be. And so then actually to be disconnected from themselves. And so within this life, maybe you can explain just briefly what a typical day in your life would look like in your in how you go about living your Dharma in today's world.
Sure. Well, a lot of this changed for me in 2020. I had been in corporate America. I'd been working in an advertising and creative production company for about 13 years. And some of that was very valuable experience. I loved the people that I worked with. But there came a point where I realized it was time for a change. Part of that change was a move in location to a place that's closer to nature. Part of that change was getting back into something that always has enriched my life, which is gardening, organic gardening. We have 15 raised beds and really haven't bought too many vegetables from the grocery store since 2020. So,
Wow.
like tomatoes, eggplants, cucumbers, squash, you name it, growing it all right around the house, you know. And so my typical day is I get up typically around 4:30 in the morning, do practice, do dream work, do journaling, and then eventually make my way out into the gardens. And that's weeding and pruning and dealing with just garden stuff, watering. When that's done, I sort of shift gears and I do some nature connection work. So that might consist of me going out to the Chattahoochee National Forest. There's miles and miles of trails that flank the river that flows through here. And I have certain places that I do sitting practice. And then the other aspect of my life is working with people. And so much of that is organized around that work. And as you know, I work with people in a Zoom session. When that initial session is done, I take that person with me on a walk. I've operationalized this. I go out into nature, carry that person, their spirit, the themes that have stirred in the session, and I see what else comes. You know, what other snapshots may have been absorbed from the work. Then I come back, and typically it could be 10 to 20 pages of what I call a journey report. And it's commentary, it's questions, what I call quest I on questions, questions that invite the person to a deeper level of inquiry into these aspects we've been talking about, what's trying to happen. And some of it might be what I call scent trails, like books, videos, etc. So it's a very full process and takes a good bit of time. But that's kind of a free offering that accompanies the session. And then I have a whole other evening self. I'm really kind of a night bird. It's like morning is, if I can make myself get up at the 4 o'clock hour, then, it's a good flow. But there's this other part of me that also likes to cook into the late hours, writing, being with the night air, being with the night creatures, the forest. So that's the rhythm. That's the rhythm.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for sharing. I think what's coming up in me is your way of living is a beautiful representation of how Dharma is possibly portrayed, in the sense of aligning what you love, aligning what you're good at, and aligning what can serve others. Mm-hmm. And so I think this identity of the Zoom and then going offline into what you love, being in nature, connecting with spirit, and then kind of, I guess in your word, gestating that back into a form that is useful for somebody to go on these scent trails and start to realize there's these little trails in what they've shared with you, to say, wow, that would be a really exciting journey to go off. That looks like it's leading to a path that I would really enjoy. And so I think you living in this kind of dharmic way is a great kind of role model for people to try to explore it in a novel way themselves, because a lot of people say within purpose work of do what you love and follow your passions.
Right.
It's not really clear about how that can come about for a lot of people. And yet, if you love being in nature and you love connecting with self, this is a great way of synergizing those things together.
Right.
So the word that came to my mind is you're living into your rich life. And this rich life concept, as I've used the word full before, and I've used the word authentic, is this idea of it's unique to each person. It's unique to the individual, and no one should try to copy exactly what it is you do, but there is opportunities to see different ways of doing things, to break you out of your mold, to realize, oh, that path isn't the only path. That religion isn't the only religion. I can be open enough to say, what's on the other side of the fence, what's down that pathway to go and see. And if I don't like it, you will never come back to the same place, but you'll return maybe to a similar area as a new version of yourself. And so maybe you can talk a bit about within this way of living you have right now, how you feel like you're living your rich life and what your rich life might evolve into in the future, or where you see it blossoming.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the copying idea. I mentioned this loose confederation of wayfaring poets. They're all different. They all practiced different spiritual practices. But they had a commonality, and that, I think, is what I'm emulating. There were three common denominators among all of them, regardless of their spiritual orientation, religion, etc. They had a contemplative practice, of one kind or another. They connected with nature, and they had some form of creative expression. So it's like those are the three C's I think about. There's this great Japanese poet, Santoka, who he even has a poem where he says, Basho is Basho. I can't be Basho. I can only be Santoka. But he's emulating some quality of Basho's life. And Basho emulated another poet's life, Saikyo. And some of the Japanese poets looked back to the Chinese poets, like Stonehouse and Cold Mountain, as, here are these elders back in time, and they are serving as guides for me now, 500 years later, and they openly wrote about this. So, I get intrigued, especially with there being so many possibilities of spiritual exploration and so forth. I think that there's some process of resonance where we're drawn to what we need to encounter. And that's what I try to encourage in people. You mentioned the mountain and hermit metaphor also, or the sort of archetype of the hermit at the foot of the mountain. The way I think of this, not only in my own personal life, but my work with people, is there's the mountain, there's the path that is that person's unique journey of self, as you've invoked it. I can't know what that is fully. I can only be someone who accompanies. In the Japanese tradition, there's this word sendatsu. It means guide. It can be a literal guide, like a fishing guide or a mountain guide, but in a more metaphoric way, it's someone who accompanies you in part of your journey. And, I think of it as I can't really know. I can only offer pointers. In a sense, we're both learning from the mystery school of that person's soul. That's kind of how I think about it. And part of that, to go circle back around to your idea of the rich life, is, I don't think of that in terms of monetary terms, and I don't think you do either. But where are we being nourished? What's authentically nourishing? What's going to nourish that sense of purpose? And that's why I keep coming back to this idea that we're apprenticing to something that's connected to us, but that's larger than us. Being guided by, I recently read something where Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the poets from the Northeast, had this idea of the oversoul, which is connected to us, but is also a larger source that is guiding us potentially. Jung also talked about the daimon, the muse, almost like we each have this tutelary spirit that steers us and gets our attention and tries to get us to pay attention to certain things. If we can stay aligned to that, if we can stay in touch with the pulse of that, I think my own experience suggests, and what I've seen with people I work with, is that the more we can do that, it leads us to that rich life you're talking about. Yeah.
And how would you recommend somebody to identify the pulse for themselves? How to identify that little thread or that path to go on? What are some of your recommendations there?
Yeah, I mean, some of the greats have said, I think you invoked it in this conversation, follow your bliss. It's what is it that actually opens up the heart mind versus what closes it down? There's a metaphor I sometimes speak about that comes out of the Chinese poetic tradition, which is the world of red dust. And it's this idea that there's places, there's people, there's circumstances, there's conditions that have to do with daily life that can become a source of strain, a source of even kind of like Francis Weller talks about slow trauma. It may not be a bomb going off. It may not be some car wreck that is the trauma. It's what Mark Epstein calls the trauma of everyday life. It's this sense of being carried away from our vital essence. And so the way I think about that is we get too much of the world of red dust on us, and we have to purify. We have to purify that dust off. And in the words of Carl Jung, we think that nature is dirty. Well, in actuality, we go to nature to get clean again. So there's this sense of nature being literally a healer, literally an agent that can invoke and invite us back to a place of purification. And when that happens, when the red dust gets removed from our shoulders and our eyes, I think that is how we get back in touch with that pulse. And that pulse might be showing up in dreams. That pulse may show up in terms of gravitating toward a type of experience. Or it might be that pulse is, as we've talked about, the creative process, which I don't just define as arts like poetry, painting, music, dance. You're developing your business. That's creativity. Raising kids. That's creativity,
Yeah, for sure. There's, I guess, within the beingness of purpose, it's really not so much about what you're doing, your vocation. It's more about who you're being in each of these different aspects as the creative way of living your life. This is the full expression. And you kind of touched upon a point there that's kind of been close to my heart recently. It's this idea of we've been very good at physical hygiene in the last couple of hundred years or so. And we are not very good at mental, emotional, spiritual hygiene.
Right.
And kind of talking to that nature's aspect of cleansing away the hustle and bustle of the mind through mindfulness or through meditation, and cleansing away the emotional baggage you have through the practice I like to do of screaming at the river and shouting and releasing and allowing my expression of emotions that I might have suppressed in the day or in the weeks to finally be released in a way that is fully held by the environment, and there's no backlash. And each time I do it, there's just these amazing synchronicities that occur.
Yeah.
It's really profound. Within synchronicities, I also want to just mention about that one. It was a very curious practice that I came across, which was one, to become aware of synchronicities and seeing them in nature and reflecting on how and where your path might be in alignment with yourself. And the other is to actually ask for them to clarify the path. There was a coaching program that I started called Metamorphosis, and the idea had come to me when I was out at the river nearby here. And one day I went out, I wasn't sure if I was going to go down that path or not. And so one day I went out to the river and I spoke out loud, if Metamorphosis is aligned for me, I want you to show me a sign. And I want those signs to be 2 eagles flying. And I looked up and there were these 2 birds flying. And I was like, okay, pretty close.
Yeah.
Good effort.
Yeah.
And then I looked the other way and then there was 2 eagles flying. One flew directly above my head, circled around me, and then flew off into the distance. And I was like, okay, you got me there, universe. Fair dues, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And so within these synchronicities, I think it's just this curious reflection of if and as we are connected, then we are this divine creator, and it's just up to us to kind of get out of our own way. And this is what I call in relation to authenticity. It's which parts of you have you layered on as filters in order that you believe you can fit in to society? Which parts of those need to be, as your proverb, the stone needs to be let go of or needs to be dissolved in order that you can finally float downstream in the way that you were always meant to do.
Right.
And so for each person, it seems to be different and it seems to be unique. And yet there are these similarities within nature being one of the most powerful tools. For me on this recent journey over this last year, I've dived into breath work as a modality for connecting with the body, for processing emotions, and for creating space for clarity mentally and also spiritually for ideas to just drop in of just moments of insight.
Right.
And all of these aspects kind of feed into this full authentic expression, feed into this rich life. And I also believe that when you're on your path, when you're living your Dharma, when you're living your richest life, wealth will flow to you as a result rather than you're going there for it. It's a nice byproduct as of the fact of being on purpose, being in alignment with the universal energies,
and not blocking the nourishment that's trying to come your way. As a friend of mine puts it, a nourishment barrier. Which is a new concept to me.
And this is also an interesting journey of I think within the creative there was, I don't know who came across the word, but it was the curse of the creative, and it was basically, I think, also the curse of the spiritualist, which is to say I must live a life of humility, of kind of what's the word, kind of a basic life without having anything flashy, without having anything
simplicity. I think that simplicity has its place, but that doesn't mean poverty.
Right.
Yeah. We have enough impoverishment. Yeah,
for sure.
And circling back around to this notion of paying attention to the signs that you just brought in. That is an amazing story about the eagles. It makes me think of Robert Moss, the dream work guide. He has a book called Sidewalk Oracles, and even talks about it as cultivating your own language of shivers, where you're paying attention to the wider energies that are happening as hints. Yeah,
the shivers is also a good one, is that getting shivers in your body is a great analogy. It's kind of like this chemistry with someone you love or someone you just meet, of that kind of feeling, but then often you'll have someone say something and you'll just have shivers. And I've kind of seen that as being when it's aligned, or when it's something that is profound in its simplicity and profound in its expression, and yet you don't really realize it, or the person might not even be aware of it. And so it's always great to share with somebody that gave me shivers, because it helps them to see, oh wow, what was it about that? And they can start to see themselves in this way. These are all very interesting explorations into this concept. And circling back to this creative expression that you have right now within your poetry, I'd love for you to share a bit about what your latest book of poetry is focused on, and how it differs or is similar to the first three that you've written.
Yeah, it's probably more related to my first book of poetry, in the sense that it's dealing with nature, dealing with experience in nature, but also the inseparability of nature and psyche. This word psyche in the modern context has tended to be translated as mind, but the original translation of psyche is soul. And there's a gentleman by the name of David Hinton who's done a lot of writing about the Chinese tradition, and he has some exquisite descriptions of some of the early Taoists whose practice was to go into nature and to essentially let go of the conditioned self, to merge with what is called Suyan, or Dai Shizen, great nature, to the point that it's cosmos looking at cosmos. It's human consciousness merging with nature. And then out of that, the outflow of that might have been painting a painting of a landscape, but not painting that painting with human ego, painting that painting from this deeper place of having merged with the spirit of place. Or, because there are some people who are both painters and poets, a poem unfurling from that level of experience. And so that's kind of what I've been experimenting with this new book of poetry that I've been working on, is going back to that formula of experience, gestating, integrating, and then expressing, and seeing what comes from that. And sometimes I go into the forest or go hill walking in some of the higher elevation areas, and it's just about the experience. And there is no outward expression. It's more about absorbing, being shifted, being changed. But other times, there's this sense of having gone and experienced something and received almost a teaching, and realizing that's not just a teaching for me, that's a teaching for others. And so it's gestating on that, integrating it, and then seeing how it comes out, how it unfurls for the benefit of others.
Yeah, beautiful. And that unfurling, I'm curious, does that come about when you just sit and you write somewhere, or there's already a range of ideas that are kind of floating around in your head, of lines, of passages that you've noted? Or
Yeah, it's both and. Sometimes like a seed phrase will come to me out on the trail, and I will make a note of that. And then later on, I'll come back around and I'll meditate on that seed phrase, and it will then kind of almost unpack itself. Other evenings, I will read some of the lines of the old ones. I'll have a couple of cups of sake, and then off we go.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that night owl aspect of something about the calmness in the air and the energy, the darkness, and just this allowing of, I don't know, inside of me there just feels more peace.
Yeah.
And it feels easier to be creative or to do certain things in the evening time. Doesn't matter what kind of productivity or what kind of things I set up in the daytime. Yeah. It's just a completely different energy.
Well, so much of the frenetic quality of wherever we live begins to drop. It's like, I feel that tangibly. It's like, okay, half the world is asleep. It's easier to be awake, in that mode,
Yeah. Yeah, and the sun's rays definitely reduced, blocked by the earth. Beautiful. We're just coming towards the end of the hour, and I want to be conscious of your time. And something I love to end each session with is, if you're able to share, if you could only share one concept, idea, sentence, and that was the only thing you were remembered by, and that was the one message you have to share with the world. No pressure.
Yeah.
But what would you leave? What would be that parting message?
What's coming to me in this moment, Rich, is there's a natural quality of being at home in our own skin that is blocked by the degree to which we hold on to shame. And for me, I really think that has to be something on our spiritual dashboard of trying to minimize and purify, kind of like the world of red dust, purify that sense of shame about our own natural intelligence, our own natural wisdom. Being at home in our own skin, despite what the world says, despite the conditioning we may have received, and the shame-based experience of early life. That is a trailhead that I feel is part of our collective work, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, very powerful. I feel compelled to share a little bit about that, which is my own personal journeying with shame and using this holding onto the rock and going down the river analogy again. A part of the reason why you feel like you need to hold on to it is the shame of where you think it's going to go. It's not okay to go down that river. Somehow you've formed this idea in your head to say, I'm ashamed to admit that I'm going to be going that way. I must hold on to this piece. And yet for me, when there's been these experiences where I've been in a collective and I've been able to lean into shame and I've been able to bring shame into the spotlight with others, it almost instantly, in most cases, it dissolved like that, because the shame is all held internally. When someone else can shine a light on it and saying, that's not even that bad, what are you even talking about? Suddenly all that shame dissolves. But I 100% agree with you that shame is an amazing breadcrumb to be following, to identify what are really these parts of ourselves that are hiding in the dark, that we've put in the dark aspects in the shadow self to keep ourselves protected. And actually that has the seed of creation that is a part of your life's Dharma that's just waiting to be unfolded. So thank you for that final note. Very powerful. And thank you again, Frank, for having this conversation today and sharing your wisdom. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and share with you and journey with you. And final note, if anybody wants to find out more about you, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, for the work is my website, schoolofsoftattention.com. And then with regard to the poetry, currently it's the 3 books I have are at homeboundpublications.com. And I'm working on several other writing projects, but those will come on the horizon at some stage. Yeah.
Nice. Amazing. Well, thanks again, Frank, and enjoy your journeying today in the wilderness, and look forward to speaking to you soon.
Great to see you, Rich.
Thanks, Frank.
Bye-bye.
We'll just end there, but just wanted to say, thank you personally for the session. I really enjoyed it.
Great conversation.
It's always a pleasure. And any final notes from you?
No, I'm curious about your creative process, and if you are working on any writing, because I sensed a while ago the potential of something stirring for you in that department.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I did actually 3 things to share on that. 1, I did start writing poetry myself. I was kind of exploring it. 2, I've just yesterday said yes to joining a bi-weekly poetry medicine circle, which I'm sitting with. It's either going to be a 3-month journey, or I'm going to sign up to a 12-month journey to then bring out my own book of poetry at the end of it.
Great.
And I do feel called to write a song and to sing a song. I think using my voice has been an aspect of shame that has come about for me. And there's a lot of fear of humiliation that comes up from singing. And someone had this very funny analogy of how crazy it is for us to judge our ability to sing in relation to how little we've practiced it. It's kind of like giving someone a guitar and saying, play the guitar. And they're like, I can't play. I've never played it. Whereas singing, someone sings and they say, you're bad at singing because you can't do it. And actually, everything, it needs to be finessed and practiced. But I'm definitely feeling more called to the written word and allowing that to channel through. And also the spoken word. It's definitely 2 areas that I'm curious in. And for sure, there's been a lot of analogies that have come to mind, which are helpful to start to understand this concept of who we are and what is life about, what is this rich life, what is this journey that we're on, and seeing someone else's lens, as I said before, to give you a new perspective. And so it's interesting to see how poetry can start to, I think what came up to me yesterday, just last night, was around both on the level of meaning in the words, but also at the level of frequency in the expression of it. So
Yep.
the literal frequency of the spoken word reverberating at a certain level to activate your DNA, to activate these different parts of you, just like it would do in a resonance if you chime a chime and then something else starts vibrating.
Yeah.
The word has that. So it's interesting that seems to be what your teacher was also sharing with you in
Absolutely.
bringing that through.
Yeah. 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 And, the old Japanese Shinto idea that there's koto dhamma, that there's word, dhamma, soul or spirit, koto word spirit, gets into that, like where not just poetry but song ends up becoming a way of essentially channeling a certain vibration and then resonating out and affecting others, which then wakes something up for them. And and then I think the other thing that we inherit in this Western paradigm is, I call it comparisonitis. When we get into like, well, I'm not as good as that, or, well, no, but you're perfect for where you're going, not necessarily where they're going. It's not the same as shame, but related. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the judgment. It's the self-critic that's very quick to judge and to chastise.
Right.
And for some reason, someone else had the analogy of if your ego could be a person, you would 100% say that they were schizophrenic of some sort. At one moment they're telling you not to do something, and the next moment it's saying, what a great idea that was that you did that. And you're just like, what the hell?
Right.
How am I supposed to win this battle? And then it's kind of this reflection of...
That's a great point.
And so you're living with this voice inside of your head, and the challenge is to not identify with it, even though it can be very strong. And having a child, for me, really woke up that aspect of me of recognizing in children, this full authentic expression. There is no filter. There is no kind of choosing the words. There is just being the full feeling and the wildness of it. And it's kind of taming or channeling this beast, and then recognizing that aspect of you lives inside of your head and speaks. And it's the one that you listen to a lot of the time, and you're allowing this egoic identity that was formed before you were 7 to make decisions for you about your life and to make calls on whether you should do this or that, which aren't really connected with your broader self or even the higher self around you.
Right.
But interesting you raise about
Elizabeth Gilbert, who she had a book come out a few years ago called Big Magic.
Okay.
And she's a novelist, but it's probably one of the best books I've seen where somebody gets into that sense of working with the inner critic. And she realized one day that part was trying to protect her, but was doing it in a way that was belittling and trying to keep her scared so she wouldn't risk. And so she comes up with this whole thing of, okay, you're a voice at my table. You can go on the journey, but you can't drive and you can't get directions.
Yeah, that's
good.
A great analogy. And it's also that the big one of, I'm going to listen to you and I'm still going to make the decision.
Right.
I'm not going to ignore you. I'm not going to push you to the side, because that's belittling the belittling part.
Right.
And
sure.
It's not loving yourself. But I think that's great. It's again with children. It's being the adult, and being the adult, being the parent is not to ignore and to push down. It's to really take in, support, and say, and I'm going to make the decision at the end. I've heard you. Thank you.
Right.
And
right.
Some ideas. I don't know if you've had this, but it's sometimes when you're just driving along or when you're going somewhere, you have just a wild thought of like, what if I just jumped, or what if I just went down this thing? And it's just, why would that be a good idea? But
right. I think that there's a natural saboteur that we all have.
Right. Yeah.
And obviously it's not to take that part seriously, but I just think it's the opposite energies that get activated because we're trying to embody these other energies, which is about growth, forward motion, and it's almost like the drag, that happens on a boat. It's like, and it's to not be derailed by those saboteurs.
Yeah, that's been definitely a journey I've been on of just this retraining of listening to myself, and it can be hard at times because it's hard to know which is the voice speaking and which one is actually aligned and which one is fear because that's the direction to move through, or if it's fear because that's protecting you from something that's actually dangerous.
But if you look at some of the stories of the old ones, like the Buddha or even Jesus, like they have these voices that come up. It's Lucifer and Mara, and both of which are tempting the journeyer away from their task.
Yeah, that's definitely the curious challenge of life, of just getting to know each of these parts, to understand who's the one speaking, then who's the one actually trying to drive the car, where you're actually trying to take it. And if you've just grabbed the wheel from me for a moment to take me on another way, I definitely have a way of going on walks with my family and being swayed into looking at this thing or that thing and being interested in what I come across. And my wife is very much, I want to get to the end. This is the part where we were going on this walk. We weren't going to look at all the things. So there's different ways of approaching it. But yeah, I feel like I could speak with you for a long time. It's been a while since we last spoke. Hopefully we can again.
It's been great. Well, good luck with your podcast, and
thank you.
Yeah, I will certainly spread the word. Do you have like a website for the podcast, or?
Not a website. I'm going to put a page on my website. I'm just working on things right now. I've recorded a few episodes, and I'm going to release them soon.
Cool.
But yeah, I will definitely share that with you. One thing I wanted to ask was if you could send over a brief bio and a photo.
Sure.
That would be really useful. And just drop in, I obviously have your website link, but any other link you want to include on the podcast would be great. And final note is, I'm wondering if you have any good recommendations for sake.
Yes, I will send that too.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Well, take care of yourself, Rich.
Yep. Thank you so much. Pleasure to speak to you again, Frank, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you found some nuggets of wisdom that you can take away and start implementing in your own life. If you did, then it would mean a lot to me if you gave the show 5 stars and subscribed. That way you can come back for more next week and help spread the word. And if you really loved it and you want to find out more about how to work with me and how I can help you, then check out the links below or head over to my website, www.richadriansmith.com. And if this is bye for now, then I wish you a rich life.